It had been a long, grueling day on the ranch, but as the sun began to dip below the horizon, I could finally feel the tension in my muscles begin to ease. There was something about the vast open spaces, the smell of the earth, and the hum of nature around me that made everything feel a bit more manageable. As a retired Special Forces operative, the work I did on the ranch was nothing like the operations I'd once been part of, but it had its own rewards. There was no rushing or chaos here, just hard work and quiet satisfaction. The land was mine to shape and care for, and in many ways it was my peace after years of chaos. The animals, the vast acres of land, the sound of wind rustling through the tall grasses, it was all part of the routine. That evening, after finishing my chores and making sure the animals were fed and secure, I took a moment to relax on the porch of my modest home. I leaned back in the old rocking chair, my boots resting on the railing, and let the cool evening breeze wash over me. I had a cold drink in my hand, and as I sat there, I felt a deep sense of peace that had eluded me for years. Life on the ranch was simple, and that was exactly what I needed after the intensity of my previous career. I wasn't one to rush out of my uniform when I got home, especially when there was still work to be done. The Special Forces gear I wore was more than just a uniform to me. It was a symbol of the men and women I had served with, a reminder of the sacrifices made, and the bond we shared. The uniform was something I wore with pride. It was a part of me, even if I no longer served. On the front lines, the mission had changed, but the sense of duty remained, and I carried it with me wherever I went. The ranch had become my sanctuary, but that didn't mean I'd shed every aspect of my past. There was honor in my work, and my uniform was a reflection of that. But that night, as I sat on the porch and sipped my drink, everything was about to change. I first saw her walking down the dirt path toward my property. Karen, the self-appointed queen of the neighborhood. She wasn't a woman you could ignore. Her high heels clicked loudly against the gravel as she strutted toward my gate. She was the president of the HOA, the same woman who had made it her mission to police everyone's life. She had an air of authority, as though the rules of the neighborhood were her personal commandments. People in the area joked about her, but deep down, we all knew she wasn't one to be taken lightly. Her idea of a well-maintained neighborhood was strict and rigid, and no one dared to step out of line. I had heard rumors for weeks about Karen pushing more community standards, rules that seemed to come out of nowhere, but somehow she had managed to twist them into official regulations. Everything from yard maintenance to parking spaces was under her scrutiny, and I had seen her scold neighbors for things as minor as leaving their trash cans out for a few extra hours after collection. But I had never thought she'd come after me. As Karen's heels clicked closer, I could feel the irritation building inside me. She was walking with that air of superiority she always had, her head held high like she was the ruler of the entire neighborhood. As she drew nearer, her eyes locked onto me, and I immediately knew why she was here. There was no other reason for her to march down this path, to come to my house. I had already heard whispers that she had been inspecting the residents' appearances as part of her HOA crackdown. It wasn't about the quality of the lawns anymore or the paint on the houses. She had started focusing on things that weren't anyone's business, like how people dressed. Karen came right up to the steps of the porch and stopped, staring down at me as though I were some kind of specimen she needed to evaluate. The expression on her face was one of deep disapproval, like she had just discovered an unsightly stain on a piece of fabric. I put my drink down on the railing and raised an eyebrow, waiting for her to speak. "Excuse me," Karen called out, her voice high-pitched and cutting through the stillness of the evening. "You're in violation of the community standards." I looked up at her, genuinely confused. "What?" Her eyes narrowed as she pointed directly at me, her finger almost trembling with righteous indignation. "You're wearing that uniform. You can't wear that here. It's inappropriate for the neighborhood." She practically spat the words out, as if the sight of my military gear was an offense to her delicate sensibilities. "I demand you take it off immediately." I felt a rush of heat spread through me. My heart skipped a beat as I tried to process what she was saying. There was no way I was hearing her right. My uniform, my military uniform, was the source of the problem? The uniform that represented years of service and sacrifice, that symbolized the strength of my comrades? And this woman had the audacity to tell me to take it off, as if it were some kind of fashion faux pas. I couldn't believe it. I stood up slowly, my calm demeanor hiding the fire that was growing inside me. The nerve of this woman. I had worn that uniform with pride, and I had the right to wear it however I pleased. This was my property, my land, and no one had the right to tell me what I could or couldn't wear. Especially not someone like Karen. "Karen," I began, my voice cool but with an edge that only years of military training could provide. "This is my ranch, my property. I'm not taking off my uniform. You don't have the authority to tell me what to wear." Her face flushed with anger as she crossed her arms tightly across her chest. "I don't care what you think. This is a community, and you represent us all. That outfit is a violation of the standards. If you don't take it off right now, I will be reporting you to the HOA board. There are rules about how we present ourselves, and your uniform does not fit the image we're trying to maintain here." I clenched my fists, but I took a deep breath. This wasn't worth losing my temper over. Or so I told myself. I needed to remain composed, to handle this with the level-headedness that my training had instilled in me. "I don't care about your rules, Karen," I said, my voice steady, though the anger simmered just below the surface. "And I'm not taking off my uniform. If you don't mind, I've got better things to do." I turned toward the door, hoping that this would be the end of it, but Karen wasn't done. Of course she wasn't. She never let anything go. "This isn't over," she shouted, stomping her foot in frustration. "I will make sure the HOA enforces this. You'll be sorry." I didn't even look back as I stepped inside. I could feel her seething on the porch, but I knew the confrontation wasn't over. I knew Karen wouldn't let it slide, and that's when I realized this was more than just about a uniform. She had made it clear that she wanted control, and I wasn't going to let her take that away from me. The stage was set. Karen had made her move, but I was prepared for the battle ahead. She had underestimated me, and now she would learn the consequences of trying to control someone who wasn't afraid to push back. The next few days after Karen's visit were tense. I could feel the heavy weight of uncertainty pressing on me. As I went about my routine on the ranch, taking care of the animals and managing the day-to-day tasks, it was impossible to shake the feeling that something was coming. Karen, with her insistent attitude and obsession with community rules, wasn't the type to let something go easily. I had been through enough confrontations in my past, both on and off the battlefield, to know when someone was about to escalate a situation. And with Karen, it was clear. This wasn't over. I kept my head down, working diligently, but the whispers from the neighbors were unavoidable. People were talking about it. Karen had already gone around telling everyone that she was going to take care of the uniform issue, and that I would pay for ignoring the HOA rules. The neighborhood had always been peaceful, but Karen had a way of stirring up trouble, especially when she was upset. I couldn't understand why someone would take such joy in controlling others, but that was exactly what Karen had always done. I went through the motions, but it was impossible to focus. I knew Karen was the kind of person who would pursue this to the bitter end, no matter how ridiculous it seemed. And sure enough, the next morning I found an envelope waiting for me on the doorstep. It was from the HOA, the same HOA that Karen practically ran. I opened the letter, my frustration growing with each word. The HOA had formally filed a complaint against me for violating neighborhood standards by wearing my military uniform on my property. It was laughable, and yet it was infuriating. The letter demanded that I attend a meeting with the HOA board to discuss the issue and resolve it. The tone of the letter was as condescending as it was absurd, implying that I was in some way a threat to the neighborhood because I chose to wear my uniform. I could feel my blood boiling as I read the words again. It wasn't just about wearing a uniform. It was about Karen's need to assert power over people. She had no real authority over me, and she knew it. But that didn't stop her from trying to force me into submission. I had had enough. I wasn't going to let her push me around any longer. I wasn't afraid of Karen or the HOA board, but I was done tolerating her attempts to infringe on my rights. This time, I would take a different approach. I wasn't just going to show up at the meeting and argue with Karen. No, this time I would send a message. If Karen wanted to make a spectacle of me, then I would make sure she got the show she was looking for. I reached for my phone and began dialing numbers. Some of my old team members from my Special Forces days. The ones I knew would have my back in an instant. They weren't just soldiers. They were highly skilled operators who understood the importance of strategy and intimidation. They weren't afraid of confrontation, and they certainly weren't afraid of someone like Karen. The first call was to Steve, my old team leader. He'd been through every operation with me, and I knew he could assemble a group quickly. Within minutes, Steve had gathered a team of former Special Forces operatives, all of them skilled in combat, but also in handling situations that required a more nuanced approach. These were men who had faced life-and-death situations, but they weren't afraid to stand in a room and make people uncomfortable when necessary. "We've got your back," Steve told me over the phone, his voice steady and confident. "Let's show them how things are done." By the time the day of the HOA meeting arrived, I had a small but formidable team by my side. There was Steve, of course, along with Mark and Jake, two other operatives I had served with. Each of them was a highly trained individual, capable of handling any situation that might arise. They were men of few words, but when they spoke, people listened. The idea was simple. Karen had already made this personal. It wasn't just about the uniform anymore. It was about her blatant overreach and the need to put her in her place. I suited up that morning, putting on my military uniform with the same care and pride I always had. It wasn't just clothing. It was a part of me, a representation of everything I had stood for. I wasn't going to let Karen or anyone else make me feel ashamed for wearing it. As I slipped into the familiar gear, I knew it wasn't just about showing up. It was about showing Karen that she couldn't get away with her behavior. She couldn't bully people into submission just because she was upset. The meeting was scheduled for the evening, and as I drove to the community center, I felt the weight of the moment. This wasn't going to be an ordinary meeting. This wasn't going to be a quiet, polite discussion about my uniform. I was going to make a statement. Karen had chosen to make me the target of her obsession, and now it was time to show her that she had picked the wrong person to mess with. When we arrived at the community center, I could see the surprise on the faces of the other HOA board members. They had been expecting a simple one-on-one meeting with me, but they hadn't anticipated the group of military professionals who walked in behind me. My team and I were dressed in tactical gear, our movements calm and controlled. We weren't there to start a fight, but we weren't there to be intimidated either. The presence of my team alone was enough to shift the energy in the room. The board members' eyes widened as they took in the sight of us. They weren't prepared for this level of response. Karen was already at the front of the room, her face tight with anger. She was staring daggers at me, and when she saw the rest of my team, her expression shifted from irritation to shock. She wasn't used to being challenged in this way, especially not in front of the people who had once followed her every directive. She stood up sharply, her eyes blazing. "What is this?" she demanded, her voice rising. "You can't bring them here. This is a formal HOA meeting." I stood tall, meeting her gaze with calm resolve. "Oh, it's formal, all right," I said with a smile that didn't reach my eyes. "You wanted to make a spectacle of me, Karen. Now it's my turn." My team remained silent behind me, but their presence was enough to make the room feel smaller, more confined. It was clear that Karen was rattled. The other board members who had once been so eager to side with her were now visibly uncomfortable. They didn't know how to handle this situation. They had expected me to show up alone, unprepared for what was about to happen. Karen opened her mouth to respond, but I raised my hand, cutting her off. "We're here to discuss the complaint about my uniform," I began, speaking directly to the board. "I'm sure Karen has told you that I'm violating some kind of community rule. But I'm not here to discuss petty grievances. I'm here to put a stop to Karen's overreach." Karen shot me a sharp look, her face red with frustration, but I could tell she was losing her grip. The board members were looking at her now, unsure of what to do. The power dynamic had shifted, and Karen no longer had the authority she thought she did. She opened her mouth to speak again, but the words didn't come. She was cornered. "I've been in uniform for over 2 decades, serving this country," I continued, my voice calm but firm. "The men and women I served with didn't lay down their lives for something as trivial as HOA rules. And for you to come to my home, on my property, and tell me to take off my uniform, well, that's something I won't stand for." The room was silent. The weight of my words hung in the air, and I could see Karen's face go pale. For the first time, she seemed unsure of herself. The people around her, the board members who had once eagerly enforced her will, now looked at her with doubt in their eyes. She had overstepped, and now she was losing control. One of the board members, a quiet man who had been sitting in the back, cleared his throat. "We may need to reconsider the validity of this complaint," he said, his voice uncertain. "This seems to be a personal matter rather than an HOA issue." Karen's face turned bright red as she stood up, her hand shaking with rage as she pointed at me. "This isn't over!" she shouted, her voice rising in fury. But I was done. I had made my point, and the board saw that. The board voted immediately, and the complaint was dismissed. The HOA rules about uniforms were absurd and baseless. Karen had manipulated the situation for her own gain, and now she was being exposed for what she truly was. The board, now fully aware of her overreach, sided with me without hesitation. As we left the room, the tension had lifted, but I knew that Karen wouldn't give up easily. She would find another way to impose her will, but for now I had won, and in that victory, the neighborhood had been reminded that some rules were worth breaking, especially when they were as ridiculous as the ones Karen had tried to impose. After the intense HOA meeting, I returned to my ranch with a sense of relief I hadn't felt in years. The weight that had been pressing down on me, the suffocating tension created by Karen's incessant meddling, had finally lifted. It was over. Karen's reign of terror over the neighborhood had come to an abrupt halt, and I had stood my ground. She had underestimated me, and it had cost her. I felt that familiar sense of victory, the one that came when you faced a challenge, head-on, and emerged victorious. But beyond that, there was something else, a deeper satisfaction that I wasn't just fighting for myself, but for everyone who had silently endured her oppressive behavior. This wasn't just about my uniform or my right to wear it. It was about the way Karen had tried to control everything and everyone around her. It was about standing up to her and showing the neighborhood that her tactics wouldn't work anymore. The days following the meeting were filled with a subtle, yet palpable shift in the atmosphere. The neighborhood, once under Karen's thumb, began to breathe a little easier. People who had been silent for far too long started speaking up. The whispers I had heard in passing over the years began to grow louder, and before long, stories of Karen's oppressive reign spread like wildfire. Neighbors who had once feared retribution from her or the HOA board were now sharing their own experiences of her petty tyranny. It turned out that Karen had spent years bullying people into submission, enforcing absurd rules, and imposing arbitrary fines for anything she deemed inappropriate. There were tales of children being scolded for playing too loudly, of neighbors being fined for having a bush that was too unkempt according to her standards, and of people being harassed over the most trivial things imaginable. She had created a toxic atmosphere where everyone was afraid to speak out, afraid to break the mold she had crafted for her perfect neighborhood. And yet, it wasn't until I stood up to her that the floodgates opened. The meeting had been a turning point. When I had walked in with my Special Forces team, it wasn't just to confront Karen. It was to show everyone that standing up to her was possible. I wasn't the only one who had suffered under her rule, but I was the first to push back. As more and more people began to share their experiences, it became clear that Karen wasn't just a nuisance. She was a bully, a small, petty tyrant who had managed to get away with her behavior for far too long. Over the next few days, my mailbox began to fill with thank you notes from neighbors, notes that ranged from simple expressions of gratitude to heartfelt letters of support. They thanked me for taking a stand, for showing them that they didn't have to live in fear of Karen's whims. I couldn't help but feel a sense of pride as I read each one. These were people who had been silenced by fear, but now they were beginning to find their voices again. They had seen what I did, and they realized they could do the same. I wasn't just fighting for my rights. I was fighting for the entire neighborhood, for everyone who had been oppressed by Karen's rule. Some letters were from people who had never spoken to me before, their words tentative but full of appreciation. It was clear that Karen had made them feel small, insignificant, as though their voices didn't matter. But now, they were speaking up, and they were thanking me for leading the way. I found it humbling. I had gone into the HOA meeting with the intention of defending myself, of showing Karen that she couldn't get away with pushing me around. But what I didn't expect was the ripple effect it would have throughout the community. It wasn't just Karen who had been isolated. It was the fear she had instilled in everyone. Her grip on the neighborhood had been severed, and now people were beginning to take back their power. Even the HOA board, which had been hesitant to confront Karen for fear of her retaliation, began to distance themselves from her. They had seen her for what she was. A power-hungry woman who had used her position to control others. And once that truth was out in the open, it was hard to ignore. Several board members quietly reached out to me, offering their apologies for not standing up to her sooner. It was a strange feeling, but I appreciated their sincerity. Karen's influence over the HOA had been so great that even the board had been afraid to challenge her. But once I had exposed her for the bully she was, they no longer felt the same sense of fear. Meanwhile, Karen had begun to isolate herself. She had never been a particularly popular figure in the neighborhood, but now, after her failure to assert control over me, her social standing had all but evaporated. I heard from several sources that she had stopped showing up to neighborhood gatherings, that people had started to avoid her. The once feared HOA president was now a pariah in her own community. I had no sympathy for her, but I couldn't help but feel a little sad that her downfall had been so self-inflicted. She had chosen to build her power through fear, and when that power was challenged, she crumbled. As for my Special Forces team, they had gotten a good laugh out of the entire situation. For them, this had been an easy mission, far less dangerous than the ones we had faced during our service. But that didn't make it any less rewarding. They had shown up for me without hesitation, ready to back me up, and they had enjoyed the opportunity to make an impression on the HOA board. It wasn't every day that they were asked to step in for something as trivial as a neighborhood dispute, but they had taken it in stride. After all, there was something satisfying about helping a friend take down a bully, even if that bully was just a neighborhood HOA president. I thanked them for their support and promised to call them again if Karen ever decided to escalate things further. But for the time being, the neighborhood was quiet, and I was content. The ranch had always been my refuge, and now it felt like I could finally enjoy it without the shadow of Karen's threats hanging over me. I didn't have to constantly look over my shoulder or wonder when the next complaint would arrive. The peace had been restored, and that was all I needed. Karen kept her distance after that. I rarely saw her around, and when I did, she never approached me again. Her attempts to control me had failed, and that had become clear to everyone. There was a strange sort of relief that settled over me, knowing that I could go about my days without worrying about Karen's next move. The neighborhood, once stifled by her presence, began to return to a sense of normalcy. People started to relax again. The fences weren't as high, and the smiles on the faces of my neighbors were a little brighter. It was as though a weight had been lifted from all of us, and the fresh air felt sweeter than it had in a long time. I continued my work on the ranch, the days passing peacefully and uneventfully. The animals still needed care, the land still required attention, but the quiet rhythm of ranch life was enough for me. As for my uniform, it became even more symbolic to me in the wake of everything that had transpired. I wore it with pride, never once thinking about taking it off. It was more than just a piece of clothing. It was a reminder of who I was, of what I had fought for, and of the strength it took to stand up for what was right. And as I worked under the wide open sky, I knew that no one, not Karen, not anyone, could take that away from me. For the first time in years, I felt a sense of peace. My mission had changed, from serving in special forces to protecting my home, my values, and my community. And with that peace came a deep sense of fulfillment. Karen's grip on the neighborhood had been shattered, and in the aftermath, we had all learned an important lesson, that sometimes standing up to the bullies is the first step toward restoring the harmony that should exist between neighbors. Share your own HOA experiences and stand up for what's right with the HOA stories. Your voice matters.